Investigating this case is like trying to put together a puzzle where the pieces stubbornly refuse to fit. Five friends vanished on a snowy night in the remote forests of California, and to this day, no one can explain what drew them there. What compelled the boys from Yuba to embark on this fatal journey? Was it a trap they failed to notice? Perhaps they became victims of someone's sinister game. Or could it have been something far more terrifying, something beyond ordinary understanding? The main characters in our story are five friends from Yuba County. I'll briefly introduce each of them so you can get a better idea of who they were. These five friends were participants in the Gateway Program in Yuba County, an organization that supported people with mental or physical disabilities. Yes, each of them had certain limitations, but those who knew them recall that the media exaggerated these nuances, especially during the wave of sensational coverage when the story of their disappearance spread across the country. Let's start with the youngest of the group, Jack Hewitt. He was only 24 when he disappeared. Jack was the only one among his friends who could neither read nor write, and his speech difficulties made it hard for him to find a job. His mother estimated his IQ at around 40. But those who knew Jack personally remember him as a kind, quiet, and sincere young man who was always pleasant to be around. Jack's best friend was Ted Wire, the oldest in the group, at 32. Ted was cheerful and friendly, and he shared Jack's simplicity and openness. Despite his challenges, he worked and even spent several years stocking shelves at a local grocery store. Another member of the group was Bill Sterling. He was intelligent, though not particularly ambitious. One Gateway coach recalled that Bill could have achieved much more if he had pushed himself harder. Bill was also deeply religious. He didn't just read the Bible for himself on weekends, he would visit hospitals to read scripture to patients and the elderly. The next friend was Jack Madruga, 30 years old at the time of his disappearance. He was the only one who owned a car, a 1969 Mercury Montego. We'll return to this car later, as it played a central role in the story. Although a bit slow in school, Jack did well overall. After graduation, he joined the Army and drove trucks for several years. And finally, Harry Matthias, who joined the group about a year before their disappearance. He was 25 and stood out from the rest. Harry wasn't considered slow, but he lived with a serious mental diagnosis, paranoid schizophrenia. Like Jack Madruga, Harry served in the Army, though his experience was very different. There, he encountered violence and drug use, and after returning home, he often ran into trouble with the law. His past included fights and public conflicts that drew attention. Now that we've met all five, it's time to move on to the events that preceded their disappearance. On February 25, 1978, the Gateway team was scheduled to participate in a special Olympics tournament. Victory in that tournament would guarantee a paid weekend trip to Los Angeles, and all five players were eagerly looking forward to it. They had been training for weeks, and to boost their spirits the night before the competition, they decided to attend a UC Davis basketball game. On February 24th, the friends set off for Chico, about 80 kilometers north of their home. The game was expected to end around 10 p.m., and the boys had carefully planned to make sure nothing would interfere with tomorrow's big event. Some had even laid out their uniforms in their bedrooms ahead of time and promised their parents they would go straight to bed upon returning home to get a good night's rest. Jack Madruga, the only one who owned a car, gathered his friends into his 1969 Mercury Montego. The drive wasn't long, but some parents, including Bill Sterling's mom and dad, insisted he take a jacket because of the cold. Bill just smiled and reassured them they would be back soon. One quick stop for the game, then straight home. No one could have imagined that this would be the last time the five friends were seen alive. According to witnesses, the boys did attend the UC Davis game. They cheered loudly for their team and left immediately after the final whistle. On the way home, they stopped at a small store to buy snacks. The clerk later recalled that the boys came in shortly after 10 p.m. and purchased Coca-Cola, milk, and several packs of candy. Then, within just a few hours of leaving that store, events began to unfold that remain a complete mystery to this day. On the morning of February 25th, the boys' parents began calling one another, hoping their sons had simply stayed overnight at a friend's house. But as each call ended with the same answer, it became clear that no one knew where they were. Concern quickly turned to panic. By 8 a.m. the next day, Jack Madruga's mother contacted the police. These young men were predictable, living according to a strict routine. They always accounted for their particular needs when making plans, which made their sudden disappearance a serious cause for alarm. The Butte and Yuba County Police immediately issued a search warrant for Jack's Mercury Montego. Yet the first few days brought nothing. No leads, no sightings, no trace of where they had gone. It was especially baffling. The boys hadn't just missed the long-awaited tournament they had trained for with such enthusiasm. They hadn't returned home at all. At first, law enforcement tried to reassure the families, suggesting the boys might have simply gone for a drive or decided to spend time somewhere in the city. But the parents knew better. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. And soon, their worst fears began to be confirmed. On February 28th, news finally came. The missing boy's car had been found. A forest ranger from Plumas National Forest called the Yuba County Police Department, reporting that he had seen an abandoned vehicle on the Oroville-Quincy Road. He admitted that he had actually noticed it back on February 25th, but hadn't thought much of it at the time. That area was known for its icy, treacherous surface. Abandoned cars weren't unusual there. Sometimes people left them while waiting for help. Other times they parked to admire the scenery or go skiing. Plumas Forest was the kind of place where it was easy to get lost, not only in space, but in time. It was only days later, when the ranger heard police were searching for a Mercury Montego, that he realized the significance of what he had seen. This became the first real clue in the puzzle of this baffling story. For reasons no one could explain, the car was discovered more than 112 kilometers in the opposite direction of the boys' route home. The spot where the Mercury Montego sat was high in the mountains, at about 1,340 meters above sea level, beyond the snow line of the Plumas National Forest. To reach it, they would have had to drive more than 100 kilometers in the middle of the night, much of it on rough dirt roads, and take a turn that no one could reasonably mistake for the way home. The first question was obvious. Why had they gone there at all? But the car itself raised even more questions. During inspection, police noticed signs that someone had tried to free it by spinning the wheels. Yet the situation was far from hopeless. The rear wheel had simply slipped off the pavement and lost traction. It was a problem any one of the 5 young men could have solved within minutes. Some theories suggested that, because of their mental limitations, the boys simply didn't think to get out and push. But this explanation falls apart under scrutiny. Jack Hewitt, though he struggled most academically, regularly helped on the farm and was skilled at riding motorcycles. Jack Madruga not only loved his Mercury Montego, he repaired it himself. These young men were not helpless. They worked, they traveled, they had basic mechanical skills. One of them surely would have realized how to fix such a simple problem, unless something or someone prevented them from doing so. Inside, the car looked as if they were returning from a normal trip. Empty soda cans, candy wrappers, and a program from the UC Davis basketball game, with the score scribbled on the back, littered the floor. It seemed as though the boys had been calmly driving home, and then, for no clear reason, they turned off the highway, climbed 140 meters up a snowy mountain, got stuck, and made no effort to free the car. Instead, they rolled down the window, left the vehicle unlocked, and vanished. At first, police suspected a lack of fuel or perhaps a mechanical failure. But when the engine was tested, it ran perfectly. There was still a quarter tank of gas. Then nothing. Weeks passed. For long months without progress. Only scattered, inconclusive witness reports. One thing, however, became clear. Something had forced the 5 young men up into the mountains, away from safety, to abandon their car and disappear. The first serious clue in the case appeared only on June 4th of that year. By then, most of the snow on the mountain peaks had already begun to melt, opening access to areas that had been cut off for months. That day, a group of motorcyclists headed up about 20 miles north of the spot where the car had been found. Their destination, one of the service trailers used by forest rangers in Plumas National Forest. These trailers were fully equipped for survival, heating, food, and enough supplies to last more than a year. But during winter, they were buried under heavy snow. Only in early June did they become accessible again. When the motorcyclists reached the trailer, they noticed one of the windows was broken. A heavy, suffocating odor was pouring out from inside. Stepping in, they were struck by a disturbing sight. Beneath the broken window lay scattered, empty tin cans. Near the doorway to one of the bedrooms, a pair of tennis sneakers. And in another room, something that chilled them to the bone. On the bed, completely wrapped in blankets, the head covered as well, was a human body. They immediately alerted park services and the police. When the blankets were removed, the condition of the remains was horrifying. The body was in an advanced state of decomposition. The legs had suffered the most, the socks and shoes had been removed, and the feet looked as if they had endured severe frostbite and gangrene before death. The condition was so extreme that 5 toes were simply gone. The police quickly recognized the clothing. It matched what one of the missing boys had last been seen wearing. Later, after the forensic report, and thanks to a wallet found on a nearby nightstand, it was confirmed. The body was that of Ted Wire. It appeared that Ted had spent the final months of his life inside the trailer. He died lying on the bed from pulmonary edema caused by pneumonia, weakened by the cold and by severe injuries. But what shocked investigators most was the way his body was found. Ted was completely wrapped in a sheet, even his head covered. It is almost impossible to do this alone, especially so tightly, with the arms pinned against the body. This immediately raised disturbing questions. Who wrapped him like that? And why? Why did Ted remain in the trailer without making use of the resources that could have saved his life: food, warmth, and shelter? One more strange detail stood out. The tennis shoes lying near the trailer door belonged to Harry Matthias. Ted, on the other hand, had been wearing brown leather boots that night, but those boots were never found. Just outside the trailer were 2 supply sheds. One of them was stocked with enough food to last more than a year. The other contained heating equipment, blankets, lanterns, and other survival tools. Some items had been taken, as shown by the empty cans scattered inside the trailer and beneath the broken window. But the amount was almost nothing. The police report mentioned only 36 open rations, while the press speculated there may have been as many as 72. Even so, this was shockingly little for 5 men who might have been trapped there for months. And it wasn't as though food had run out. Entire boxes in the shed remained unopened. Even more puzzling, although both sheds had been forced open with a crowbar, nothing was taken from the one that held blankets and lanterns. This was utterly incomprehensible, given that Ted's official cause of death was hypothermia, with signs of frostbite. Why, with warm clothing and heating equipment available, did they not use it? Why didn't they even start a fire when books and paper inside the trailer could easily have been burned for heat? After examining the scene, investigators concluded that only Ted Wire and Harry Matthias had been in the trailer. Jack Hewitt, Jack Madruga, and Bill Sterling were nowhere to be found. Many people later asked a logical question. Why, after months of searching, did no one check the trailer, a structure built specifically for survival? The answer was both simple and terrifying. The trailer was located far from where the car had been found, about 32 kilometers deeper into the mountains. In winter, that road was buried under snow and ice. Reaching it meant walking for hours, knee-deep in snow, in nothing more than a t-shirt and jeans, in the middle of the night. The chances of surviving such a journey were almost zero. And yet, Ted Wire's body was found there, inside the trailer. Police immediately launched a full search of the surrounding area. And over the next few days, they made the final, heartbreaking discoveries in this case. Search teams decided to retrace the route between the trailer and the spot where Jack Madruga's Mercury Montego had been abandoned. About 18.5 kilometers from the car, further up into the mountains, they found 2 more bodies, those of Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling. The 2 men were lying next to each other. Madruga's body had been partially mauled by wild animals, most likely coyotes. Sterling's remains were reduced to a skeleton. Perhaps, during the exhausting trek, one of them began to succumb to hypothermia.
In its later stages, the body shuts down, extreme fatigue sets in, along with an irresistible urge to sleep. But that sleep is one from which you never wake. Maybe they decided to rest, and that became their last stop.
Or, even more tragically, one collapsed from exhaustion and the other refused to leave his friend, staying by his side until the very end. For months, their bodies lay there together, buried beneath the snow. In the merciless silence of the mountains, their only comfort was each other. At around the same time, a few kilometers northeast of the trailer, Jack Hewitt's father was combing the mountains with a search party. Beneath a bush, he noticed a jacket. When he picked it up, a human spine slipped out. Nearby, searchers found Jack's skull, several bones, and the remains of his clothing. Like his friends, he likely died of hypothermia. His jeans and shoes were found separately, possibly a result of paradoxical undressing, a strange phenomenon in which people in the final stages of hypothermia feel a sudden, burning warmth and begin removing their clothes. Not far from the trailer, about 400 meters away, investigators also discovered 3 blankets from the National Park Service and a rusty lantern. They may have belonged to a random traveler, but it's equally possible that one of the boys had used them. The autopsy of Ted Wire revealed a chilling discovery. At the time of his disappearance, Ted had been freshly shaven. Based on the length of his beard, the coroner concluded that he had survived in the trailer for 8 to 13 weeks after the night they vanished. That meant Ted endured at least 2 months inside that trailer, and he probably hadn't been alone. Evidence suggested he may have been cared for by Harry Matthias. After all, Ted was too weak to break into the supply sheds or open the food rations by himself. Someone had done it for him. Someone who was wearing Ted's boots. But then, the question, what happened to Harry? His shoes were there. His presence was certain. And yet, no trace of his body was ever found. More than 40 years later, the mystery of Harry Matthias remains unsolved. 5 friends who had made simple, predictable plans, 5 friends who never intended to go into the mountains, ended up stranded in lethal conditions. Their car was abandoned, left unlocked, while they set out into the frozen wilderness. Just 13 kilometers down the road was a hotel, staffed with people who could have helped them. And yet, they went the opposite way, higher into the mountains, deeper into the cold and the dark. 3 of them died along the way. 2 reached the trailer. 1 perished inside it. And the last, Harry Matthias, walked back out into the snow and disappeared forever. One of the lingering questions is how they even managed to reach the trailer in the first place. One theory is grim but simple. Jack Madruga, Jack Hewitt, and Bill Sterling may have collapsed and died that very first night, while Ted and Harry somehow pressed forward, step after step, into the white silence. The car had been found about 32 kilometers southeast of the trailer. At first glance, that distance didn't seem insurmountable, but the path they took makes everything more puzzling. There were 2 possible routes. The first, much easier, ran just west of the trailer. A gentle road, only about 18 kilometers long, that would have led them straight to shelter. But then why does the number 32 appear in the reports? Because the second route was far more complicated. It started in the same direction, but then veered east, looped around the mountain, circled back from the north, and only then reached the trailer. That road stretched for about 32 kilometers. And somehow, it was this longer, harsher route that matched the trail they had taken. Some have suggested that all 5 boys may have made it to the trailer and later split up, either in panic or in a desperate attempt to return to the car. But the evidence contradicts this. Too few rations were used to have fed 5 people for even a few days. And investigators later confirmed that only Ted Weir and Harry Matthias had been inside that trailer. You might ask, why didn't they just take the shorter, 18-kilometer trail? The answer is painfully simple. They didn't know it existed. None of them had ever been in those mountains. They had no map, no knowledge of the area. And perhaps most unsettling of all, the route may not have been chosen by them at all. Back at the trailer, investigators found something even stranger. In the second shed, Right next to the survival equipment stood a gas tank capable of heating the entire shelter. All they had to do was turn the valve, but no one ever touched it. This was even harder to explain than the unused flashlights or the absence of a fire. Why didn't they use everything at their disposal to survive? Were they afraid of something? Afraid that if they lit a fire, someone or something would see it? Another detail deepened the mystery. Most of the food cans had been opened with a standard church key, a common can opener in the 1970s. But one can was different. It had been opened with a P-38, a small military knife and can opener issued to soldiers. At first, this led to speculation that Jack Madruga might have made it to the trailer. He had served in the army and he might have carried one, but there was no other evidence to place him there. On the other hand, Harry Matthias had also served in the military. Given his background and his practical nature, it was even more likely that the P-38 had belonged to him. Taken together, the facts point toward a haunting possibility. Jack Madruga, Bill Sterling, and Jack Hewitt may have died that very first night, lost in the snow, trying to reach the shelter. Only Ted Weir and Harry Matthias pressed on and survived. For nearly 3 months, it seems, they endured in that isolated trailer, surrounded by supplies they could have used, but for reasons we may never understand, chose not to. And now, to the testimony of the only person who claimed to witness a key moment that night, when the 5 young men from Yuba left their car. His name was Joseph Jones. He was driving into the mountains to check conditions before a planned family trip that weekend. On Friday, February 24th, Joseph wanted to reach his cabin at the top of Plumas National Forest and see how deep the snow was after recent storms. At an altitude of about 1,400 meters, where the road was already covered with heavy snow, his car got stuck, almost in the same place where the boys' Mercury Montego would later be found. He got out to push, but suddenly felt a sharp, burning pain in his chest. It was a heart attack. Joseph already had heart problems, and he realized that if he kept going, he might not survive. Gasping for air and barely able to stand, he returned to his car and collapsed into the seat, hoping the pain would subside. Eventually, he drifted into sleep. Around 11:30 p.m., he was startled awake by a whistle, faint but distinct, like someone calling a dog or trying to draw attention. Joseph raised his head, looked in the rearview mirror, and saw headlights about 30 meters behind him. It could have been his salvation. He climbed a small slope and spotted a familiar shape, a 1969 Mercury Montego. That was the car police would later discover. But behind it, there was another vehicle, a rusty red pickup truck. Near the 2 cars stood 6 or 7 people. One, according to Jones, appeared to be a woman holding a baby in her arms. He started shouting, hoping that someone would come and help him. But at that moment, the conversation stopped. The headlights went out, and everyone he could see quickly got into the pickup truck. The car reversed off the road and disappeared into the darkness, driving down the slope. Joseph decided that this was just another group that had also gotten stuck and was now taking advantage of the opportunity to leave in someone else's vehicle. Perhaps they just didn't want to get involved with a stranger in the middle of the night. About an hour passed. Through the mirror, he noticed the flickering of flashlights in the forest, as if someone was walking among the trees. He went out again and started calling. But as soon as his voice rang out in the silence, the lights instantly went out. By this point, he was exhausted and irritated. He started the engine to warm up and left it running. But around 4 in the morning, the gas ran out and the engine died. His only choices were to freeze in the car or walk downhill. He chose the latter. After walking several kilometers through ice and snow, he got lucky. He met a driver who picked him up and took him home. Once there, after warming up, Joseph went to the police and told his story. Most versions of the story found in articles or heard from people talking about the case treat Joseph Shaw's testimony as almost indisputable fact, especially his statement that he saw a red pickup truck that allegedly interacted with the boys. But many details in his story raised doubts. We will talk about this later. Shortly after the 5 disappeared, the Yuba County Sheriff's Office announced a reward of $1,215 for any information that would help find them. This resulted in a flood of calls from across the country and even from abroad. People claimed to have seen the boys in the most unexpected places, at the Miami airport, at a movie theater in Ontario, and dozens of other locations. Obviously, as soon as the money appeared, there were many who began to invent stories, hoping to get a piece of the reward, even if their testimony had nothing to do with reality. Apart from Joseph Shaw's words, which were at least partially confirmed by his car getting stuck that night, most of the other statements seemed frankly dubious. Nevertheless, investigators decided to take a closer look at two of them. The first report came from a woman at a gas station in Brownsville, a town the boys would have passed through if they had stayed on their intended route. She said that when she arrived at work near the store, she noticed a car with two men sitting inside. They were smiling broadly and, to her, seemed mentally challenged. They greeted her, and she greeted them back. At the same time, two others were standing in a nearby phone booth. A little later, those same two men entered the store, bought chocolate milk and candy bars, then returned to the car where the others were waiting. The group then drove away. The store owner confirmed her story, adding that he had seen them there 2 days in a row. When police later showed photographs of the 5 missing men, the woman recognized everyone, except for Gary Mathias. But here's the problem. According to her, the visits took place on February 25th and 26th. That's after the disappearance, which happened on the evening of the 24th. For this story to be true, the boys would have had to drive up into the mountains, abandon their car, then come back down, buy snacks, miss their tournament, avoid going home, and then, for some reason, return to the mountains where they died. The sequence makes almost no sense. This version could easily be dismissed as a fabrication in hopes of reward money, if not for one unsettling detail, which we will discuss later. The third piece of evidence that caught the attention of investigators came from a wealthy resident of Yuba County named Redrick. He owned property in the Plumas National Forest. According to his testimony, about a year before the disappearance, Ted Weir approached him while accompanied by a middle-aged man and a teenager who looked about 14 to 16 years old. They told him they were hunting. But this account completely contradicts what we know about Ted. He was afraid of the forest, avoided the dark, disliked weapons, and would never harm animals. The Weir family confirmed that they had never heard of these two companions and could not imagine why Ted would be in the mountains with such company. Perhaps Redrick simply mistook someone else for Ted. Or perhaps, like others, his words were influenced by the reward money being offered. But then again, why would a wealthy man invent such a story? And here, just as in the Brownsville testimony, one unsettling detail will emerge later. At this stage, we've reviewed all the confirmed facts and testimonies in the case. Some appear plausible, others completely far-fetched. Yet most researchers eventually leaned toward one version. The boys went into the mountains, either under duress or of their own free will, abandoned their car, and became lost in the forest, falling victim to the unforgiving elements. From the very beginning, however, both in the press and in the words of some investigators, there was a tone of bias, harsh and often unfounded, remarks about the boys' mental state. And among the 5, one name was mentioned more than any other: Gary Mathias. For some, he was the villain who led his friends to their deaths. For others, he was the only one who tried to save them. His past allows for many different theories to be imagined. But one fact is undeniable. Gary Mathias is the only one of the 5 whose body was never found. He vanished into the dark woods, leaving behind nothing but questions. Meanwhile, the media quickly created a convenient image: a dangerous, schizophrenic psychopath who could manipulate his friends and lead them to their deaths. And this version, despite the lack of direct evidence, was supported even by some of the families. They believed if anyone could have escaped that situation, it was Gary. In the version where Bill, Jack, and Jack Madruga died on the way to the trailer, only Ted and Gary made it inside. But Ted was already in a critical state: frostbite, gangrene on his feet. He couldn't even feed himself. Someone had to feed him. Someone had to make sure he stayed warm. And when Ted finally died, someone wrapped his body in 7 blankets. The trailer showed clear signs of life: burned down candles, scattered playing cards, empty food cans. The fact that Ted survived for so long suggests that Gary most likely fought for him until the very end. You can imagine him forcing Ted to eat, trying to comfort him, preparing to walk into the forest for help, and then disappearing. But Gary was dependent on his medication. 2 pills a day kept his schizophrenia under control. Without them, his mind could quickly unravel. And if he really did survive after Ted's death, then without his medication, he may have lost his grip on reality, leaving the trailer in panic, abandoning his belongings in the snow, and wandering into the unknown. His body was never found. Police checked hospitals, psychiatric wards, even prisons, nothing. And here, to understand the whole picture, we need to return to the man who supposedly saw them that night, Joseph Jones. At first, he was described as a respectable family man who happened to be in the mountains and tried to help the police. But behind that image was another truth. In his hometown, people knew him as a chronic drunk. He often drove while intoxicated, and his car was frequently found in ditches. At first, neighbors helped him, but his rudeness and ingratitude quickly turned people away. One relative even said, "If Joseph Jones is ever killed, it will be impossible to solve the case. There will be plenty of people with a reason to do it." The story he told about a cabin in the mountains was a fabrication. He had no cabin, no plans to stay there. Most likely, he simply drove into the mountains drunk, got stuck in the snow, and then invented a convenient legend. His testimony changed every time he told it. At first, he claimed he saw several people near the car. Later, the number ranged anywhere from 2 to 12. Then he explained it away, maybe because of his heart attack he got confused, or maybe he even hallucinated. But the contradictions only fueled suspicion. When police came back to question him again, Joseph was in the hospital after another heart attack, this one linked, at least in part, to his constant drinking. Doctors confirmed the diagnosis, but added, many of his symptoms could have been caused by alcohol, not just physical illness. And in the hospital, his behavior grew even stranger. Nurses recalled that before the police arrived, he was nervous, almost in tears. But when the investigators began to question him, he suddenly calmed down and quietly said, "You think I know more than I'm saying, don't you?" A strange line for a witness who supposedly had nothing to hide. There were also other witnesses who saw him at a mountain gas station. He sat at the counter, head in his hands, repeating, "I should have done this 2 years ago." This pushed some to believe his past, tied to local drug dealers and marijuana sales, might explain his strange behavior. Perhaps he had seen something and was too afraid to speak. Even his story about the red pickup truck kept changing. Sometimes it appeared, sometimes it vanished from his account. It seemed that once police began to notice connections between him and the boy's disappearance, he quickly invented details to protect himself. Joseph Jones died in 2004 without ever shedding light on his true role in this story. And here, we return to the other testimonies. Remember the woman at the gas station who said that on February 25th and 26th, she saw 4 of the boys buying chocolate milk? She also mentioned a rusty red pickup, the same kind of truck Joseph claimed to have seen. That very same type of vehicle also appeared in the story of a wealthy man named Redrick, who once said he saw Ted in the company of an older man and a teenager, supposedly out hunting. They too arrived in a red pickup. This entire case remains one of the most puzzling mysteries to this day. 5 healthy young men, who had everything they needed to survive, perished in the winter forest with no clear explanation. They were frightened by something or someone so much that they chose to run into the snow, choosing a cold death over staying where they were. Was it simply a chain of tragic coincidences, or was there something truly sinister in the mountains that night? We'll probably never know. I don't believe in a mystical explanation. Without a doubt, there is a logical reason. The only problem is, we just don't know it yet. What do you think? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I'd really like to hear your version.